moment. I'm not. See to the computer. It's my pleasure to welcome Margaret Barker, Dr. Margaret Barker. She's an old friend of Christians Aware. I remember when we had our summer school a very long time ago now in Hothorpe Hall. Margaret was one of our speakers then, and I do remember it was wonderful, and I've looked into and read some of her work since then. And this is a wonderful opportunity for us this evening. Her title is The Christmas Story, an Overview. Margaret is a long-standing academic, and her main focus of study has been the Jerusalem Temple and Christian liturgy and the link between the two. And for this work, she has received a Lambeth Award, which is a wonderful thing to receive, an affirmation of all the work you've done, I think. I think Margaret has improved and increased our understanding of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and our New Testament as well. We are very grateful for all your work. I did decide that I would read out a list of your books, but I then decided I couldn't do that because the list was too long. So I chose one or two books to flag up. And one is Temple Theology. One is called The Great High Priest, which I haven't read and would like to read. Temple Symbolism in the New Testament. That would be interesting. And linking to our summer school last year and the summer school we'll have next year in Yorkshire, a biblical vision of for the environment. A biblical vision for the environment. I'm going to certainly read that before our next summer school and be in touch with Margaret as well about that. And of course, one of Margaret's books is The Christmas Story. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Barbara. Right, can we have the first slide, please, Matt? And then can we get the main picture any bigger than that, or is that oh lovely, that's even better. Right, now we are all familiar with the New Testament stories of the birth of Jesus. Many people know the Nativity icon, which has been unchanged in its essentials since the very earliest known Christian art. We look at this icon, you can see first of all that the birth, you've got the ox and the ass and the manger right in the middle and the baby wrapped in his swaddling bands. But it's in a cave, which isn't how we imagine a stable usually. Mary is lying diagonally across the picture and she's on a red blanket or rug of some sort. We're going to come back to that. Top left, we have the Magi arriving, and we're going to spend a lot of time looking at them. Then if we get to the bottom left, there is Joseph sat looking very glum indeed. And that hairy figure to the right of him is a shepherd, but he's actually Satan in disguise, tempting Joseph not to believe that this is a miracle. And then on the right, we have two midwives getting ready to bath the baby. Now, you can imagine that the baby would need a bath. You can imagine that Mary might have been something red, all sorts of things. But all these details are actually a part of the story then from the artist's imagination. And what we're going to do in the next few minutes together is look at where all these details of the icon actually came from. So we'll keep that picture up for a little bit. In the New Testament, Matthew describes how Joseph had a dream in which an angel of the Lord told him that Mary would bear a son, fulfilling the prophecy in Isaiah 7:14, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son and call his name Emmanuel. The child would be named Jesus, and he would save his people from their sins. Isaiah's name for the child, however, was Emmanuel, which means God with us, although we don't know how they understood that. Matthew continues with the story of some Magi on the icon there, top left, who came from the east to Jerusalem to find the King of the Jews because they'd seen his star in the dawn sky and had come to worship him. Now, the word worship implies that they too expected to find a divine being, Emmanuel, God with us. The chief priests and scribes that they met said he would be born in Bethlehem, and they cited the prophecy of Micah that an unnamed woman would give birth in Bethlehem to someone with the majesty of the name of the Lord. So we've had two prophets so far, Isaiah and Micah. These Magi brought gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Luke gives other details, often said to come from Mary herself. She heard Angel Gabriel telling her that she would have a son named Jesus, who would become the new Davidic king, fulfilling another prophecy in Isaiah 9:7. And we shall return to Gabriel's words at the Annunciation. Luke continues the story with the birth in Bethlehem, and he gives 4 details only. Why does he give these 4 details? The child was Mary's firstborn. She wrapped him in swaddling clothes. She laid him in a manger. Those 2 are in the icon, because there was no room for them in the inn. And that's it. Those are the 4 details. And people who are looking for historical realism say, well, we don't know what she did about nappies or what she fed him on. Well, no, Luke chooses those 4 things for a very good reason. And we're going to return to all those details. Then after the birth, according to Luke, an angel of the Lord appeared to some shepherds nearby, told them of the birth of the Saviour, the Messiah, the Lord. There's another divine being here. The shepherds went to find the child and then told everyone what they'd seen and heard that night. Now, there have been many attempts to discredit the nativity stories in the Gospels, protesting that they have no details in common, that Luke's dates are very hard to reconcile with real history, that stories were largely invented to fit the prophecies, and so on. What we have, in fact, here are 2 highly sophisticated accounts that assume a certain level of knowledge in their hearers that many modern critics do not have. The stories of the Nativity in Matthew and Luke were told within the framework of the first temple in Jerusalem, Solomon's temple, and the details all point to that setting. First, the original storytellers told these stories in Hebrew. We have them in Greek in the New Testament, but the original stories are told in Hebrew. And they would have shared the cultural memory of Solomon's temple, even though it had been destroyed some 6 centuries earlier. And second, they would have inherited the temple custom of wordplay, and this is very important. For example, the Hebrew word kezem means both east and ancient times. And so the Magi came from the east, but they were also, and this is how they would have heard the story, people from ancient times. This implies that somewhere east of Jerusalem, there was a group of exiles from the time of Solomon's temple who preserved ancient teachings and were astronomers as their ancestors had been. And we're going to come back to these people in a moment. They were not people from many nations, as the romanticized version of the story has it. They were Hebrews, not technically Jews, and they looked for the restoration of the Davidic kings because they themselves descended from those kings who were also priests after the order of Melchizedek. Now, could we have slide number 2, please, Matt? Now, their story survives in a little-known Syriac text preserved by Christian scribes, and modern scholars have named it the Revelation to the Magi. And possibly from the 3rd Christian century, a shorter version was known in early medieval Latin and was certainly known in Northern Europe before the Reformation. If you want to find this in English online, there's a very learned piece, and you can find it just by Googling the sages and the star child. And I say from page 75 onwards because the pages before that are a very learned critical edition of a Syriac text. And if you just went to the beginning, you might think you'd gone to the wrong place. But scroll through and you'll find an excellent English translation, and it's well worth reading. So keep that one up for a bit. Another example of wordplay is Luke saying there was no room in the inn. Now, the Greek word that he uses here is kataluma, and Luke also uses this as the room of the Last Supper. The word usually means a lodging place, but for the pre-Christian Greek translation of the Old Testament, we call this the Septuagint. It was used for the tent where the Lord was present during the 40 years of the desert wanderings. So this is a sophisticated Hebrew-Greek wordplay, a type that is known elsewhere. The Hebrew word is ta'aluma, which you can hear sounds very like kataluma, and Luke is playing. And so Luke was actually saying that the divine child was born outside the temple because there was no place for him there. So we have here the hint of a dispute in temple history. Now, the Melchizedek high priests, the ancestors of the Magi east of the Jordan, were ritually born in the temple. There was a ritual anointing when the human crown prince became both the Davidic king and the Melchizedek high priest. Now, the Hebrew text of 1 Chronicles chapter 29 describes the ceremony when Solomon became king, but the English translations completely obscure what actually happened, possibly because it was so unexpected. So could we have slide number 3, please? Next slide. Now, this is the passage in question. David was present when his son Solomon was made king, and these are the crucial verses, and this is the usual translation. This is the RSV. The assembly bowed their heads and offered worship to the Lord and did obeisance to the king. They made Solomon the son of David king a second time, and they anointed him as prince for the Lord and Zadok as priest. Solomon sat on the throne of the Lord as king. Now, the original meaning here was probably rather different, as we shall see. It was crucially different, because that is not an honest and accurate translation of what the Hebrew actually says. Now, the best description of this king-making ceremony is actually found in Psalm 110. Alas, this text is damaged and has to be recovered as best we can from the pre-Christian Greek Old Testament, which is less damaged. No copy of Psalm 110 has been found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, so there is no way of checking if our modern attempts at reconstruction of the original is accurate. So can we have the next slide, please? This is Psalm 110. And again, this is the RSV. And this is verse 3 only. And this is attributed to David on the occasion of Solomon becoming king. And so it accompanies the ritual described by the chronicler that we've just looked at. The crucial verse is verse 3, but alas, this is the most damaged part. So at the top, you have the Hebrew. Apparently, your people will offer themselves freely on the day you lead your host upon the holy mountains. From the womb of the morning, like dew, your youth will come to you. Now, that's the standard English translation. That is actually the key to the Nativity story, but with that translation, you probably never guess it. So when you look at what the Greek says, and that LXX, which is the Roman numeral 70, is the standard abbreviation for this Greek text, which was said to be made in 70 days by 70 scholars, and it's called the 70, the Septuagint. And this verse has, with you is rule on the day of your power among the splendors of the holy ones. From the womb before the morning star, I have begotten you. Huge difference, huge difference. But the outcome is the same. By the time we get to verse 4, after this process in verse 3, we have, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Now, you'll recall that Jesus was recognized as the new Melchizedek in the New Testament book of Hebrews. Another priest arising in the likeness of Melchizedek, Hebrews 7:15. We should therefore expect imagery from the birth of Melchizedek, here the temple birth, the ritual birth. We should expect this imagery to appear in the Nativity story, and it does. So if we unpack those impossible lines of Hebrew in Psalm 110, verse 3, several nativity images appear which explain why Luke wrote as he did. But we need to look at the lines in reverse order. So, starting at the bottom line, like, and taking it from the Hebrew, so we're looking at the top part, like dew, your youth will come to you. Like dew, your youth will come to you. Well, that sounds a bit like an advert for a cosmetic, but in fact, it's the best you can do with a very damaged Hebrew text. The Greek is different. The Greek says, I have begotten you. And if you read the same Hebrew letters with different vowels, they can also mean, I have begotten you. So let's have the next slide, please. Right, now I put in red the Roman equivalents of the Hebrew consonants. So you see there YT, LD, TYK, those represent the Hebrew letters. And then I've put around them in black, small letters, two ways you can add vowels to those letters in order to make a word. You can either add the A, the U, the E, and then the A to make it your youth, or Yulivtika, I have begotten you. And the Greek translator thought it meant I have begotten you. Now the Greek doesn't mention the dew as part of the birth process, but in Hebrew, dew, that's the word pal, is an image for the holy anointing oil, the precious oil on the head of Aaron, Psalm 133. So the Hebrew of the last line of 110 verse 3 was originally, I have begotten you with the holy oil. This is how Melchizedek was temple born. This means that an anointed one, a Messiah, was by definition a son of God. And so when Christians link those two titles, Son of God and Messiah, they were, for contemporary Hebrews, they were stating the obvious. Then going up one line, we have from the womb of the morning, which in the Greek is from the womb before the morning star. Now, morning star is one of the titles that the Davidic kings were given, as the book of Revelation shows, when the heavenly Jesus said to St. John, I am the root and offspring of David, the bright morning star. That's Revelation 22:16. He is using for himself that old royal title from the Davidic kings. So it's likely that the original Hebrew of that line was from the womb as the morning star, I have begotten you. Now the birth of Melchizedek, of course, is becoming clearer. Now, at this point, I need to give you a slight diversion, tell you a little bit about Solomon's temple. There was an important female figure in Solomon's temple who was the heavenly mother of the Davidic kings, and she was known as the Great Lady, the Gavira. Her counterpart, the neighboring culture of Ugarit, which was a few centuries earlier and to the north, a counterpart there had many titles, and using these as a guide, but only as a guide, we can recover some of the titles of the great heavenly lady of the Jerusalem temple. She was the Virgin, which can also mean the hidden or eternal lady. She's this heavenly mother. And she was the compassionate one, which is the same word as womb, rachme. So in Psalm 110, that line was probably, I have begotten you as the morning star from the compassionate lady. Now, some of you at this point will be saying, goodness, we didn't know there was a lady in the Jerusalem temple. Well, she is one of the great discoveries of the last generation of Old Testament scholars. She was there all right, and she has been lost underneath the really Protestant Old Testament scholarship, because they were the first to develop critical university type scholarship of the Old Testament, and they simply didn't expect to find a lady. And so when confronted with the possibility of translating a word one way or the other, they chose the other, and the lady stayed vanished. Now, let's look in at the next slide, please, number 6. Number 6, now, those strange looking letters on the right, that is what Hebrew looks like before they adopted the alphabet, the sort of script that we're familiar with. And if you look, and you obviously reading from right to left, and the first 2 letters from the right, in both words, are identical. They're different because I do dreadful writing. And the last letter is identical. The only difference between them is the 3rd letter from the right. And the word from the womb looks like an E backwards. And the corresponding letter in the word Miriam or Mary looks like a capital F with a bit of a tail going off to the right. But there's a difference only in that letter and only when it's written in that script. Now, Eusebius, the Bishop of Caesarea, wrote a commentary on the Psalms in the early years of the 4th century, about 320, something like that. And he said that Christians read the word womb in this psalm as Mary. This is possible if they were still using the ancient script for their liturgical text. The script is known as Paleo-Hebrew, where the words Mary and womb look very similar. So it is possible that the early Christians, I have begotten you from the womb or from Mary as the morning star, getting closer to the Nativity story. Now, the next line up in Psalm 110, verse 3, on the day you lead your host on the holy mountains. That one is full of problems. On the day is clear, but you lead is not in the Hebrew or the Greek. It's simply been added by the translators. This does happen. Your host could also mean your power. It could mean your birth. So on the day you lead your host upon the holy mountains is one big problem. So let's look at next slide, number 7. Number 7. Now, I've given you Hebrew letters, but I've given you the equivalents, the red ones, in Roman script. The top line, BHDRY, and then QD, and then an S with a squiggle on it. That's what the Hebrew actually says, in the beauties of holiness, or in the beautiful garments of a holy one. But for reasons best known to themselves, translators thought this can't be right. And so they changed the third Hebrew letter from a D into an R. And so that says on the mountains of holiness, except that's a very strange spelling of mountains. It usually has one R, and here it's got 2. So it was likely that it was originally a D, because a D and an R in the later Hebrew script look almost identical. And so you have to change the Hebrew to make it read what the English now says. And it's only the authorized version that had the original Hebrew and says it has in the beauties of holiness, which is where we get the hymn line, "O worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness." That is the original meaning of this line. Now, the Greek, the Septuagint, has in the beauties of the holy ones, plural, but the Hebrew here is singular, a holy one. Now, that word HDR, look at the top left again, HDR, Burgess means in. So HDR, that can also mean a glorious garment, hara. And so the original Hebrew almost certainly meant in the glorious garments of a holy one. Remember, Luke tells us that the baby was wrapped around. And finally, we've got back to the first line of that verse. Your people will offer themselves freely. That's the Hebrew, apparently. And it's very different in the Greek, which only, which has with you. And then here, I must tell you a little bit about how the Hebrew text, the ancient Hebrew texts, were transmitted. Because the scribes who copied them out, and this is pre-Christian and early post-Christian, they didn't simply copy. They also removed from the text anything that their generation deemed a blasphemy. And so many details of the older religion were edited out of the text. This was done as an act of piety. They were editing out the things they thought were no longer appropriate. And there are actually records of how they worked, and some of their corrections, so-called corrections, are actually listed. And these changes are called the tikkune sophorim, the cleaning up or the straightening out, it's a difficult word to translate, of the scribes. One of the features of the older faith that disappeared was the Lady of the Temple. Now let's have the next one, slide number 8. Slide number 8 is Isaiah chapter 7, verse 11. And the Hebrew there, the top line of the Hebrew, you'll see I put one letter in red. And that says, ask a sign of the Lord your God. Isaiah 7:11 is where it's the run-up to the virgin shall conceive prophecy. Ask a sign of the Lord your God. But in the pre-Christian Hebrew scroll found amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls, that red letter is different. You can see in the top line of Hebrew there, that's the letter Ayin. In the lower line is the letter Aleph. And when that word is written like that, it is ask a sign of the mother of the Lord your God. Behold, the virgin shall conceive. That makes a lot of sense. So the difference here is just one letter in terms of the scroll, but in terms of what it reveals, this is amazing. I'm now going to show you, could we have the next picture, please? I'm going to show you, this is the great Isaiah scroll from Qumran, written before 100 BC. If you look at the top, you will see in the red box the word from the mother of in Hebrew. And you'll see the middle letter looks like an X. That's the Aleph. So that word is definitely mother. And then in the purple box, it's the name Yahweh the Lord. Now, if you look at the letter in the green circle, that shows you how this scribe writes an Aleph to give mother. If you look at the letter in the blue circle, that's how he writes an Ayin. And you need to have that letter in the middle of the red box if this was just going to say what the Hebrew text now says. So at some stage, the mother of the Lord was removed from the Hebrew text. Now, it might only have been removed in some copies, who knows, but here is physical evidence that the mother of the Lord was known to exist and was known to Isaiah. Now, let's have the next slide, number 10. Next slide. Here we've got a little bit of papyrus, a fragment of an early Christian prayer. And in the red box there, we have written the word Theotokos, God-bearer, very controversial title for Mary. But if these Christians knew the version of Isaiah that exists in the great Isaiah scroll from Qumran, then they would have known of a lady known as the mother of the Lord, the Theotokos, the God-bearer. And that might join some very interesting threads together. We can't know, we can just look at the evidence and say, well, what have we here? So let's go on to the next slide. Now the next one, we're back with this verse in Psalm 110, verse 3. And what we have here, your people will offer themselves freely. And then on the day you lead your host upon the holy mountains, from the womb of the morning, like dew, your youth will come to you. And the blue words are the ones that are certain. All the red words are uncertain. And that's a pretty large number. It looks as though underneath, below, this is an attempt to reconstruct via all sorts of ways. Your mother is graciously offering you on the day of your birth the glorious garments of a holy one from the womb, or from the compassionate one. I have begotten you with dew, that's the anointing oil, as the morning star. And so this is how a Melchizedek high priest was ritually born in the Holy of Holies. And this psalm was considered by the Christians to be a prophecy of Jesus. And together with Isaiah 53, this is the most quoted text in the New Testament. So it's very unfortunate indeed that it survived in such a damaged state. Now, let's look at the next slide. The next slide, number 12. Now, the image of the Heavenly Mother clothing her newborn child survived in Christian teaching. And this is a little bit from an early Christian wisdom text, something like a catechism, in which the Heavenly Mother, and she's here called Wisdom, speaks to her child. She says, "Come to me, that you may receive as a gift the understanding that is good and excellent. I am giving you a high priestly vestment." Now remember, Melchizedek's a high priest. "That is woven from every kind of wisdom. Clothe yourself with wisdom like a robe. Return to your first father, God, and to wisdom, your mother, from whom you came into being from the beginning." Now, this Sylvanus is almost, well, it's attributed to Sylvanus. He's probably the person we know as Silas in the New Testament, who was Paul's traveling companion. But this isn't a heretical text. This is a mainstream Christian so-called wisdom text, a bit like a catechism. So, leaving that slide up for a bit, let's now return to the nativity story in the New Testament. Luke says 4 things about the birth. Jesus was Mary's firstborn. She wrapped him in swaddling clothes. She laid him in a manger. No room in the Cataluma. Again, reading the lines in reverse, we've seen already that Cataluma was wordplay on Tachaluma, the hidden place, the Holy of Holies. The word manger, remember we're thinking in Hebrew here, was the wordplay on the old name for Jerusalem. The word for manger in Hebrew is evus, and the old name for Jerusalem was Yevus. Evus, Yevus. Mary wrapped him around, translating literally, and he was the firstborn, and that's another title given to the Davidic kings. You find it, for example, in Psalm 89, verse 27. So what Luke is doing in these 4 details, he is describing the birth of Jesus in terms of the birth of a Melchizedek high priest. And Matthew picks up the morning star title when he speaks of the seeing the star in the east. Now, Matthew also describes the gifts brought by the Magi, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. These were symbols of the old temple and the Melchizedek priests. Gold was the symbol of heaven and of the wisdom of heaven. The Jewish scholar Philo, a contemporary of Jesus who lived in Alexandria, he talks about this. Frankincense was the sign of high priesthood. If you were consecrated as a high priest, the expression is literally, you filled their hands with incense. Now, this doesn't come through in English translations. It just says that he was ordained and consecrated or something like that. but the literal expression is their hands were filled with incense. And myrrh was the main ingredient of the holy anointing oil, the towel that was called the dew. And so we have the wise men from the east or from ancient times bringing back the symbols of the first temple that was destroyed by the Babylonians: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And Psalm 110 also explains Gabriel's words to Mary: the child to be born will be called a Holy One, a Son of God. That's exactly what happened in the temple ritual. So let's have the next slide now. We're going back to a text we've looked at already, 1 Chronicles 29. This is the enthronement, the king-making of David. The assembly bowed their heads, offered worship to the Lord, and did obeisance to the king. Made Solomon, the son of David, king a second time. They anointed him as prince for the Lord, Zadok as priest. Solomon sat on the throne of the Lord as king. Now, in verse 20, the top there is only one verb. They bowed their heads and they offered worship to the Lord, the king. There's no second verb. Whatever they did to the Lord, they did to the king. And this is because the new king was the Lord with his people. He was Emmanuel, God with us. And so he was worshipped. And the Magi came to worship the king whose star they had seen. Now, people who don't have a temple background will say, well, that's ridiculous. No good Jew would worship another human being. Well, I'm afraid that's wrong. The old high priests were regarded as the presence of the Lord with their people, and they did receive their worship. The real problem verse here is 22, where they made Solomon, the son of David, king the second time. Now, second time is the usual meaning of the Hebrew word here, shenit, but this word does not appear in some of the ancient versions, and it's thought to be an addition to the original Hebrew. What is interesting is the succession of prepositions le, and this preposition can have many meanings, but after anoint, it means as. You shall anoint him as the prince, this preposition le. And so if you translate verse 22 literally, it says, they anointed him as the Lord, as prince, and as Zadok, as priest. So in his temple birth, the Davidic crown prince became the Lord and the Melchizedek priest. And then the last verse makes sense. Solomon sat on the throne of the Lord as king. And the Magi, who knew this old tradition, came to find the newborn king to worship him. Right, let's have the next picture now. Now, there are other sources of information for the Nativity story, and all have temple links. In the book of Revelation, right in the middle, chapter 12, the woman clothed with the sun gives birth in the temple to her son, who is set on the throne of God. Now, this confirms that the birth of the Messiah took place in the temple, and it also explains the red surrounding Mary in the icon. It was the red of the sunrise. Right, let's have the next picture. The next slide. This is the Infancy Gospel of James, and it's also known as the Protevangelium, which is the title I've given you here. And this is a very early gospel. It's never been lost. It describes the birth in a cave and how a bright cloud appeared in the cave. As the cloud withdrew, it left a bright light from which the baby appeared. And that's what we have. Immediately the cloud withdrew itself from the cave A great light appeared in the cave. Little by little, the light withdrew itself until the young child appeared. This is pure temple imagery. When the desert tabernacle was consecrated at Sinai, when Solomon's temple was consecrated, a cloud covered the place and the glory of the Lord entered. This is Exodus 40 and 1 Kings 8. The writer of the Infancy Gospel described the cave of the Nativity as the Holy of Holies, exactly as Luke implied when he said that there was no room in the actual Holy of Holies. So let's look again at the next picture. We're back now with something we've seen before. Look again at the Nativity icon. Now, the Infancy Gospel, the Proto-Evangelium, explains the cave, but why have we got an ox and an ass? They're not in Matthew or Luke. The Magi, and we'll see this better in the next pictures, are of different ages. The child is washed at the foot of the mountain, and the star is set on a substantial beam of light. Now, in this icon, you can see a black thing coming down from heaven, and that black ball, if you look at it in detail, can't see it on this small picture, actually has the star in it. So the star comes down on this kind of rod from heaven. So can we look at the next picture, please? This is another version of the Nativity icon. This is part of the icon of the Great Feasts, 1300s from Mount Sinai. And there you see the same pictures. You see Mary on her red thing, which we now know is the sunrise. You see the child wrapped around. You see a cave. You see an ox and an ass. And then on the left, you see three Magi. And on the left, you've got a young man. And on the middle, he's got a brown beard. And on the right, he's got a white beard. So the Magi are three different ages. And they're wearing those funny things on their heads. That's a sign that they're high priests. Now, how did they know that? Well, there must have been some underground tradition, we don't know. And then I've cropped this picture, which perhaps was a silly thing to do, but bottom left here, you see the two women, and you can just see the water she's preparing to wash the baby. And on the right, you can see Joseph looking very worried indeed, being tempted to doubt that this is a miracle. And then next, we see the next one. Now this is this is the oldest known 7th century. It's now Mount Sinai. It's an encaustic icon done in wax. And look what you've got. Starting at the top, you've got the star on a pillar of light. There it is coming down from heaven. You've got Mary lying on something red, and she lies diagonally. She's lying across the mouth of a cave, and this cave is clearly at the top of a mountain or hill of some sort. You've got the ox and the ass. You've got Joseph bottom left, tempted to doubt. You've got the women washing the child, center and right. You've got the three Magi on the right, the old man with the brown beard, and the young man. There they are, different ages. And that is the oldest example of a nativity icon that we have. Very curious that it hasn't changed, but so many of the details aren't in the New Testament. So where do these things come from? Let's look at the next picture now. Here we are. The earliest depictions of the Nativity showed only a child between two creatures.
It's not in the Bible. It's not an invention.
Child between two creatures. Now they come from the opening oracle of the book of Isaiah. Remember, we've had prophecies from Isaiah and Micah so far. The ox knows its owner, the ass its master's crib. Israel does not know, my people doesn't understand. The two animals were part of the Christmas story from the beginning, but not in the written accounts, only in the art. And the oracle in Isaiah was used to explain why so many people didn't recognize who Jesus was. Now, Isaiah is the source of most of the Christmas prophecies. The virgin shall conceive, unto us a child is born, a root from the stump of Jesse. And Isaiah and his disciples are the key to the nativity icon and its details. Let's have the next picture. Next picture is another text that I mentioned at the start of this talk. We had the revelation to the Magi, and this is another one, the Ascension of Isaiah. Both these texts were used by the early Christians, and both were probably Christian editions of earlier texts, that is, pre-Christian texts. The Ascension of Isaiah, which survives mainly in Ethiopic, describes how Isaiah and a group of prophets fled from the corruption in Jerusalem and went east, remember those Magi, to live as hermits on a mountain. And the named prophets are Isaiah, Micah, Joel, and Habakkuk. Micah's prophecies include the Bethlehem Ephratah oracle, and a verse from Habakkuk is much quoted in the Orthodox service for Christmas Eve. So the prophets of Isaiah's circle are linked to the Christmas story. And so that piece from the Ascension of Isaiah, Isaiah withdrew, dwelt on a mountain in a desert place. Micah the prophet, the aged Ananias, we don't know who he was, Joel and Habakkuk, Josab, that's Isaiah's son, Shear-Yashuv, many of the faithful who believed in the ascension into heaven withdrew and dwelt on a mountain. So the Christmas prophecies are linked to this group. Let's have the next picture. Now, this is the other text, and this is the revelation to the Magi, and this survives in Syriac. And it describes a group of 12 royal priests descended from Seth, the third son of Adam, the only surviving son of Adam. They lived in exile on the Mountain of Victories in the land of Shir or Seir. They kept Adam's books in a cave, and they handed down from generation to generation, hence the Magi, an old man, a middle-aged man, and a young man. They handed down the mysteries of the books and the secrets of the words. We have the next one. Next picture now. And these sons of Seth used to look for the sign of a star on a pillar of light at the mouth of the cave. The pillar came from the uncreated light of God, which is why it comes down through that hole in the sky. And Adam had seen this star in Eden above the tree of life. Every autumn, these Magi used to purify themselves in a sacred spring at the foot of their mountain, and then go up to the cave to read their ancient books. And one year, they saw the star sign, and they set out for Bethlehem. Now, let's see the next slide. Now, this is a Flemish painting, 15th century, the Magi in their sacred spring. And there you see them, there is their holy mountain, and the three Magi, there's an old man, a middle-aged man, and a young man. And then you get another picture of them paddling in their sacred spring on the left there. And they have seen a star, and the star has in it the image of a small child. It's also part of the story. And so, question now is how is it that Flanders in the 15th century knew this story of the other Magi, the real Magi, coming, bathing in their sacred spring, and that is now almost unknown in the churches of the West. So these two texts, the Revelation of the Magi and the Ascension of Isaiah, explain all the features of the nativity icon. So let's go to the last slide now, last picture, which is back where we started. There's a cave at the top of the mountain. Got the Magi of different ages because the sons of Seth passed down their teachings from father to son. And the child washed at the foot of the mountain in the holy spring where the Magi purify themselves. And this raises some very, very interesting questions about the nativity icon. What traditions did the creators of the original design know? And we know that the earliest of these nativity pictures was painted in the 600s, 7th century. What did they know about the nativity stories that have slipped out of the mainstream of our traditions? They're not in the New Testament Gospels, and yet they were apparently common currency, well, also in early liturgies, but in one talk in one evening. I can't start to look at that, but I hope I've given you a little glimpse, and it is no more than a glimpse, of how you can delve underneath the fragments of damaged texts that remain, and using the tools of modern scholarship, you can throw a lot of light on early Christian traditions and recognize that what we have in the Christmas stories, even the basic Christmas stories in the New Testament, is actually no more than an aide memoir of a very sophisticated piece of incarnational theology. So I'll stop there, and if you want to ask questions, you can.